Right, so I will spend the next 5 minutes, brothers and sisters, just talking to you about a user experience method which you could use for mobile development, which I came across quite recently. It's been really helping me out in the work I do to make myself more efficient in the way that I deliver projects. So you might find it useful in your mobile UX projects, you might not, we'll find out. So this method has its roots in something called cognitive dysentropy theory. Now, this was devised by a guy called Roger Blake. That's him there back in 1956 at the University of California. So has anybody here heard of Roger Blake by any chance? No. So Roger belonged to a kind of a weird collective of kind of psychomaths called the Adaptive Thought Group there, who basically, they kind of existed to disrupt cognitive mapping by publishing kind of rule sets which collapsed, that kind of thing. Now, the basic premise at the heart of Blake's kind of cognitive dysentropy theory was that there must be a kind of finite set of resolution messages, and those are used for constructing cognitive grids. But he went further than that, than just describing a set that you need to do this. He proposed a number, kind of a magic number, and that number in this case was 7. So subsequently that number's been called Blake's number. But what does that number enable us to do in terms of kind of cognitive pattern mapping? Well, Blake's extension of his own theorem saw him develop kind of 3 distinct techniques for understanding kind of brain loading and kind of time-bound cognitivity. So parallel cognitive modelling, saturated state analysis, and the most popular one there, which is brain mapping, were kind of all based on Blake's number, and are kind of used extensively throughout kind of generative research in the late 50s, throughout the 60s. And in fact, this was so popular, this method of research, that Blake became something of a celebrity, which he didn't really deal with particularly well, and he kind of fell into kind of semi-obscurity in the late 60s. So, scroll forward about 50 years to the Digital Cognitivity Research Centre here at the Ohio State University. So there's a young, enthusiastic researcher called Jennifer McGinn. I don't have a photo of Jennifer. You get a photo of the university, I'm afraid. So she's studying time phases in brain modelling. So as she's searching through the dark recesses of the research faculty, she comes across some of these early cognitive dysentropy theory sessions, and she has something of a UX epiphany. Now, McGinn, she was a skilled researcher, but she was also a holistic user experience analyst, and she saw something in those research outcomes that was going to cause a big shift in her UX method and practice. So extending Blake's cognitive dysentropy theory, she developed an extensible framework for parallel UX, which enabled her to kind of disassemble kind of multiple paradigms, which was a big win in her field of work. Now, what she later published in about 2007 was the basis of her grid for UX thinking, as she called it, which you could use for mobile app development, probably. Now, as you can see here, what that grid enables is much more of a kind of deterministic approach to user-centered cognitive modeling. So what's really important there is that it helps us understand kind of those saturation states that Blake first posited back in the 50s, and kind of converts them to kind of unbalanced loops, so we can kind of do more iterative projections of UX methods. Particularly her interpretation of that self-selection model was kind of a breakthrough moment for brain mapping. So how can we use this grid in our work, for example, on mobile stuff? So in this example, I've got a grid of 6x4, which kind of maps some contingent methods for doing a strategic customer innovation. You probably recognise most of the methods in there. But the key to this grid is the application of Blake's number. So remember, his finite set of resolution messages was 7. So McGinn uses a technique that she called unbalanced clustering to kind of reduce that grid complexity. So I don't really have time to go through the whole detail of what that looks like, but what you end up with are these kind of loose associations between method clusters that begin to kind of suggest kind of some parallelism that we can introduce into the practice. So there's a few iterations to go through, but the aim really is to get to Blake's number, which is that magical 7. So what you end up with is kind of something like these things here. So parallelism means that it's possible to kind of reduce the overall method envelope, but actually supports a really broad range of techniques in space and time. So I think you probably see the value in this straight away, and where it can kind of really drastically notionalize concept work. Except, of course, this is all utter bollocks. There is no cognitive disentropy theory, and there's no grid for UX thinking. There isn't a Roger Blake or a Jennifer McGinn, but there is, of course, a Blake's 7. So, what am I trying to say in all of this? So, I've developed off the back of this my own, what I'm calling UX method interpolation theory, to deal with all this new method shit that I can't keep up with, all right? So in short, in UX, I think there's too many methods, too little time. So simply choosing the right methods at the right times is probably a reasonable strategy, for example, mobile development. But what does that mean exactly? Well, much like the kind of best camera being the one you have with you, I think the best methods are probably the ones you already have. So the best, the most applicable times to use those methods are probably just when you need to. And the best interpolation of kind of that wider method set is probably simply the right methods at the right times. And personally, I don't know about you, but if I'm feeling left behind with new methods or practices that I'm expected to know, I tell myself this: you don't have to know everything. You'll never know anything. And actually, as far as UX goes, there isn't and probably never will be an everything. I thank you.